Water bears, by definition, are a phylum of eight-legged, segmented micro animals. And the thing that I want you to take from that definition is the word micro animals. You see, water bears are between a half a millimeter and 1.5 millimeters long, which places them in this category of micro animals because they can't be seen with the naked eye. They're only visible through a microscope. However, the big difference between micro animals and microorganisms is microorganisms are unicellular, so they're single celled organisms. A micro animal like a water bear is an actual animal. It's multicellular like all other animals. So basically the way to think about them is they are a ridiculously tiny animal. They're really 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 small, but they are an animal. They're not a single-celled petri dish like bacteria that you would see in like a science class or something. These are an actual animal. They're just a tiny, tiny little microscopic animal. Now, there are over 1,000 species of water bears, and they exist everywhere. They exist all over the entire planet. You can find them in the deep sea, you can find them inside mud volcanoes. They exist on every continent, including Antarctica. And while you can find them at the North Pole, you can also find them in your backyard. They quite literally are everywhere on this planet. Now, if you think that fact that they're a global species and they're on every continent is cool, and it is. Wait until I tell you what makes these animals special. Because what really truly makes them special is they are quite possibly the most resilient animals on the entire planet. According to a paper that was published in Frontiers in Microbiology, it's a biology journal, or a microbiology journal rather. Water bears have been found to survive extreme conditions such as exposure to extreme temperatures, exposure to extreme pressures, both high and low, air deprivation, radiation, dehydration, and starvation. Now, that's not to mention that they've also survived in outer space. Think about what I just said. They have lived in the vacuum of space, which by far already outside of dogs makes them my favorite animal. It's literally dogs, them, and then every other animal fucking sucks after that. Like these things are able to survive in space. They're already shooting to the top of the list for me. Now, let's take a second to really dive into what I mean when I say some of these extreme conditions, because I think it's going to help illustrate my explanation of why I think they're so interesting when you can really picture the scale of the extreme conditions that I'm talking about, because it is wild. When I mention extreme temperatures, for example, they can survive in 1 degree Kelvin, which I've heard Kelvin before, but I actually was able to learn for this episode. So apparently Kelvin, I guess it measures things that are cold, because 1 degree Kelvin is negative 458 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is a temperature where gases turn into liquids. So that by itself to start is insane, because what I'm saying to you is you can't freeze them and kill them. That's not a possibility. I'm talking about negative 458 degrees here. Like that's not that's in a lab. You would have to make that. Like these things cannot be frozen. So that's all first of all. Now, they can also, like I said, they can withstand extreme pressures. So they can tolerate pressure 6 times higher than the deepest point in the ocean. And if you'll remember, we did an episode on the deepest point in the ocean, the Challenger Deep. If you haven't seen it, it's on the all podcast platforms and YouTube as well. But basically, no human could even remotely survive down there. It's not possible. Sorry, I had to get a drink there. Yeah, so it's not possible. You couldn't survive down there. You need to be in a special pressurized submarine. There's only a few people that have ever been there to that depth before because of the pressure. And these animals can tolerate pressure that is 6 times higher than that. Now, when I mentioned radiation, water bears can survive hundreds of times more radiation than humans can survive. And some of these numbers, like that one, are ridiculous to comprehend. Like, that's a crazy number. Like, hundreds of levels of radiation is one of those numbers that when I was reading it, to be honest, you read it and you just sort of move on. You don't really take the time to think about how crazy that is. I think that same thing happens in the economy sometimes. Like people will throw around like billions and trillions of dollars, and you don't really even think about like what that actually means. I feel like that's the same thing here. So to kind of give you an example, think about how preposterous it would be if I asked you how many donuts can you eat in 10 minutes? If you had to. How many donuts could you eat in 10 minutes? And you gave me a number. Let's say it was 10. You were like, I think I could eat one donut every minute for 10 minutes. I think I could absolutely do that. I can handle that. Maybe it's 20. It doesn't really matter what the number is. The point that I'm making is imagine you told me whatever that number was for you, and then I pointed to a guy in the corner of the room. And I went, yeah, it's cool that you could eat that many. Do you see that guy over there? He can eat hundreds of more donuts in that same 10 minutes than you can. Like it's not even you can't even wrap your head around it. Like that would be it would literally seem impossible. And yet these water bears are able to survive radiation levels hundreds of times larger than what we can. And I just think like you have to take sometimes statistics like that and put them in a context where you can really see how absurd they are because that one right there is probably the most insane to me. Um Also dehydration. They and see, look, I put my foot in my mouth right there because I this might be the most insane one, honestly, because they can live without water for a decade. They can literally live for up to a decade without water. It's 10 years. You can you can literally not give them any water for 9 years, and then all of a sudden give them a little bit of water, and they will be immediately fine, good to go. 9 years after the last time they had water. Now, when it comes to space, they are able to survive in space 10 days in space. They would have survived 10 days in space. And I'll be honest with you, I wish I'd looked into that a little more because I think what that means is they ran an experiment where they took them into space for 10 days and then brought them back and they were still alive. So that's not saying the limit that they can live in space is 10 days. That's just saying that we've proven they can live in space for 10 days. They could definitely live in space for longer than that. Also, let's go back to the extreme temperatures for a second. They can also survive 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And honestly, that's the least impressive one of all of these to me because while I will admit it's a crazy number. I mean, it's 3 times more than we can survive basically. I mean, 300 degrees is crazy. It's also less than blueberry muffins can survive. So I do think that one impressed me the least. Of the extreme conditions that they're able to stay alive in. But I actually did find out that heat is where they're most vulnerable. I- but at the same time, it's like as long as the Earth doesn't melt, they're not really going to find themselves in those settings. And I did see some research that talked about how they are able to survive in extreme heat for short periods of time. It's just when you start to go a little bit longer, you start to go a couple hours, a couple days. They do struggle with the extreme heat. But overall, this is by far the most durable animal I've ever heard of in my life. I mean, it's insane. Like these and once again, imagine what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an animal that looks like a caterpillar gummy bear and it's a millimeter long and it's able to survive all of this. All of what I'm talking about. You can drop a nuclear bomb on this thing and it's able to live. It's amazing.